I'm Steve Peck of Wyoming PBS. Governor Mark Gordon, now starting his 8th year in office, touts the WIP initiative, or WIP, for many valuable Wyoming projects, including making this robotics lab possible at Laramie County Community College. We'll speak with the governor as the new season of Capital Outlook begins on Wyoming PBS. Join us. Governor Mark Gordon, welcome to our inaugural edition for the new season of Capital Outlook. Thanks for being here, as you've been many times. We always appreciate that. I've checked the state statutes. There's no law that says you have to sit here with Wyoming PBS, but you do every year. So welcome and thanks.
Well, thank you, Steve. I always think this is a great program, an opportunity to really go deeper than just sort of the headline level. So thank you for what you do.
Let's begin with where we are. We're in Cheyenne, which is nothing new. Here we're at Laramie County Community College, and we're in a industrial laboratory setting that your office suggested, because this setup that we're in came about because of a program that you started and promoted. You take it from there.
Okay. Well, it was the Wyoming Innovation Partnership.
WIP.
Yeah, we call it the WIP initiative, and it's in many of our community colleges, if not all of them. This one is pretty exciting because we really wanted to focus on getting the industries that we're going to hire our graduates involved in what they're being educated with and for. This is a bunch of robotics equipment, really state of the art. And one of the reasons why we wanted to make that happen is we wanted to make sure our graduates had the most relevant education that they could coming out. And the exciting thing to me was it took us 3 years to get kind of up and running, make sure people understood it. But over the last year, we've now handed it off to the private sector. So it truly is engaged with the private sector. The education's meaningful, and then you look at what's going on here, and it really is building the workforce that is going to make Wyoming better than anywhere else.
Well, one of the things I've enjoyed about my job is going around the state, and again and again and again and again, I go someplace and I said, I had no idea something like this existed in Wyoming, and I bet a lot of people don't. It's cool, it's high tech, it's state of the art, it's relevant, and as you and your office thought and the business community thought, so well worth doing.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you the other thing that we looked at, and to my knowledge, nobody else has really done that. We said, okay, we want to measure what the return on investment is, because there's a certain amount of capital that comes from taxpayers that go into this. Of course, we've talked about what industry wants. And so we said, how do we measure that? Well, it turns out that is about a 690% return on investment over 6 years. Now, some people might question that, but what I've said is, okay, if you're willing to criticize, what's your fix? Yeah. It's open source. We want this to be a good measure, and so rather than just say, oh, that's hogwash, how do you make it better? How do you make it relevant for both? Because we really want to make sure industry understands the value of this, but also the people that really help fund our community colleges. And to my knowledge, nobody has actually done that before.
The community colleges in Wyoming are just vital to the kind of economic development looking to the future that everyone says needs to happen. And I guess a step beyond this is figuring out how to keep the people who go through this program in Wyoming. That's partly where the industry partners come in, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We wanted to make sure that our community college education offerings were responsive to the needs of industry, and we weren't just saying, here, we're teaching this, figure out how to use them. We're saying, look, we're going to work with you to make sure that you have the very best workforce you can. Wyoming kids generally have a much better work ethic than anyone else.
Sure.
Quitting time isn't 5, it's when the job is done, that sort of thing. And I've said I've always wanted to make sure that we have an ambitious workforce, one that is about problem solving, one that is about making things work a little better. And that's really the culture that's being instilled here.
It's a program as well that is intended to outlast your term in office. We're looking years down the road.
Absolutely right. My interest here was not, here's a legacy of the Gordon administration. My interest here was, here's just a better way to educate. Over the last few years, there's been a real opportunity in Wyoming to really revolutionize how we go about education. I read some time ago that people's favorite furniture is they call it the IKEA effect. It's the stuff they bought at IKEA and built themselves. They may have all this other stuff, but the stuff they actually built themselves is what they care about. And this is a program that Wyoming community colleges have built themselves.
A year ago, we spoke at the historic Governor's Mansion, which was a lot of fun. I asked you a question then, and I'm going to ask it again of you now. Then we'll get it out of the way. Which hadn't really been talked about too much at that time. I asked if you were contemplating seeking a third term, and you said that you were. You were thinking about that. Years passed, the electoral landscape in Wyoming has become more defined and sort of changed. And I don't think I've heard you say yet that you aren't going to do that. Where's your thinking now a year after that? Is that something that's still on the table, or how much are you willing to share here in or the week before the legislative session starts?
Yeah, I haven't said anything about it, largely because I'm really focused on this budget. I really want to make sure that Wyoming moves forward. That's been my intent, but I haven't ruled it out.
Really?
There'll be time. I keep going back to the Wyoming I grew up in, and you know this because your family's been in politics for a while. People never talked a year ahead or 2 years ahead.
Strange to see how that's changed.
Yeah. There wasn't a time for election, and all in due time.
Okay. So. Well, we're heading toward the biennial budget session of the legislature. You submit a budget to the legislature. Here's what I recommend.
Right.
What the governor recommends you do. They then pick it up and run with it, rip it to shreds, discuss it, twist it, change it, amend it, pass some of it, all those things. And that's the process that's been going on and is about to go on actually during the session itself. The budget-making climate in the legislature in recent years, I think it's fair to say, it's just different from what it was, say, compared to when you first came into office.
Two things about that. When I first was elected as governor, of course, I was dealing with a budget that was passed by the legislature sort of under Governor Mead's recommendation. So that supplemental budget was an opportunity to kind of think about what are the sort of points that we can make that sort of take it. It was actually good to have that budget in place because you're new to the office. I'd been in the treasurer's office. I was pretty confident that I had a good understanding, and soon learned that there was a lot more to learn. And then we really made a strong effort to go back to that tradition of we have a budget, and then which would have been our next year. That would have been 2020, and we built it over 2019 the way we still do today. We go to the various departments, and they make their recommendations, goes to our budget office. We talk about it. They make a presentation. I make my recommendations from that, and then ultimately that goes to the Joint Appropriations Committee. That first year, I think the budget process worked pretty well, and people were confident that we had come the right distance. We had made the point that it was going to be like we did in the past. We have a budget, and then that next year we don't. We're not going to do a supplemental budget unless it's absolutely essential. The problem in 2020 was on March 13th, COVID hit, and we had all the shutdown, which then occasioned some big changes. Huge dollars came in. We needed to figure out what to do with them, and then kind of carried over into the next year. So 2 years ago, we sat down, built a budget, and really had carried it through to last year, where we did a supplemental budget that was only for the really important things, getting back to that old tradition. So it wasn't like a whole new budget. that budget ultimately failed, as you remember. And so this year, really trying to get back to that old tradition, because there's two things that I think are happening. One is we do a budget every year, like you're saying, which is, I think, not the Wyoming way, not conservative and not the right thing to do. But we also are trying to turn every session into a general session. As you know, budget sessions where you have to have a 2/3 vote for a non-budget and budget item.
They're only half the length, for one thing. There's just not time.
That's exactly right. And so people are trying to bring these things in. And I really, what I have always loved about Wyoming is that we were really disciplined, both in the executive and the legislature, on what the tasks were. And I think this sort of gradual growth is not what people in Wyoming really expect or hope. So we really built this budget to be a full biennium budget, knowing that the next administration may have to address some things, but we wanted to get that floor back to where it was.
How come that change happened, do you think? What's going on there?
Well, I think there's maybe, this is how we count coup. It's less, and I will say this, the Joint Appropriations Committees I've dealt with in the past, both as treasurer and then as governor, there was a real understanding, we're the appropriators, you're the executive, but we're going to listen to you. We got the Amendment A passed and got it on the ballot because we were able to explain why it was so important that the state could invest more broadly. And we worked with the chairs. More recently, it's kind of like a power struggle. We're more conservative than you, and so we're not necessarily going to try to work with you. And it's a little bit disappointing to me because the chair on the House side a year ago said, we're going to work on school finance, big issue for this budget session. And if we actually make some progress, can we sit down with you and kind of walk through it? So I was looking forward to that. It's been crickets. I haven't heard anything about that. Now we've kind of watched what's going on and we'll see how it goes. But I think it's a disappointment. I think it's actually a disservice to Wyoming because that communication is important, even though we respect our respective territories.
A couple of specifics in the budget that I know you've expressed concern about. One is a plan, and it's advanced, made some progress through the Appropriations Committee, which would defund the Wyoming Business Council. And in fact, under one iteration, even do away with it as a legal entity. I think you have expressed disagreement with that idea. Where does that stand, and how do you hope it comes out?
Well, I think it's very short-sighted, and I don't think it reflects a knowledge of the value. It's been easy to sort of take shots, but if you really take a look at what the Business Council's been able to do, I know Weatherby, I think Brenda has written most of the legislators and said, here's what our payroll is, here's what we've brought to Wyoming. We would not be here if it weren't for the Business Council. I just saw her and Adam at the SHOT Show in Las Vegas, the big trade show for firearms manufacturing.
Remind us who you're speaking about here.
Brenda Weatherby.
And she's
one of the owners of Weatherby Arms, which has moved to Sheridan.
Right.
In a little business park that has a whole bunch of Business Council businesses there, like VacuTech and Canon Enterprises and so on. And we've got Gunworks over in Cody. There's just examples all around. There's a guy in Casper who in his off hours from Casper PD was building systems that work that are now gaining traction for law enforcement to be able to carry all the paraphernalia they have. And all of these things have kind of gotten a start under the aegis of the Business Council. And so I think it's just really short-sighted. And I say this with some historical perspective too, which I'll get to in just a second. But when you go to the SHOT Show, which is the number one sort of trade show, acres and acres of guns manufacturing, we've been able to bring industries in. We've been able to help industries like Thunder Beast here. We'd be able to expand with our presence there. And this year, because of that conversation, there's a decided sort of like, is Wyoming still really interested in having us there? And then in the case of the Weatherbees, they were saying, look, we're getting offers from Georgia, from Tennessee, from other states, to move out of Wyoming. So I think this is very casual talk. Our recommendation was there's a reason to always look and see if we can do things better. That's this WHIP program, for example. So let's take our time, do an interim, spend the time to really evaluate what's working and what's not working, what we can do better. But the talk coming out of the Joint Appropriations Committee was, let's just lop it off.
It seems to me that having something like the Business Council sends and you've hit on this already, it sends the signal throughout the region, throughout the nation, that Wyoming, quote, is open for business, which once upon a time was about the most conservative Republican principle that there was. So it's an oddity now to see it under attack from this particular quarter.
One thing that I think is almost hypocritical is there's this comment about we're picking winners and losers. And so, that shouldn't be the purview of the Business Council. Well, they're not picking winners and losers, but, that's the argument that's made. The same group is saying, okay, we're going to put a whole appropriation in the budget for a particular industry. So, it's now pork instead of Business Council, which is really unfortunate. But I talked about the historical perspective. You remember back in the 1980s how devastating it was, and we still had a steel mill in Atlantic City. We had a going concern in Jeffrey City. Fremont County was just exploding, and suddenly it all disappeared, and the oil and gas industry dried up. And I remember voting for Amendment 4, which was the legislature can take a certain amount of money to help promote economic development. It wasn't particularly well done. I think Gill Windows down here is maybe one of the few surviving companies from that time. But it became clear that we needed a disciplined approach to how you grow business. And that's where the Business Council came from. And it helped grow, Leeds, which is here in Cheyenne. Randy Bruns did a phenomenal job. Becky's still doing a job. We just brought in, one of the old fishing companies, the Eagle Claw, because we could broadcast, here's what we've got in Wyoming. So Eagle Claw is right here in Wyoming. That's where I used to go down to our old telephone store and buy flies to go fishing on our local river.
The effort is justified.
Yes.
So let's try it.
Yeah.
And
not everything is going to work. I mean, that's the other thing. If anybody's built a business, and believe me, I've built a few, not everything works.
No guarantees.
No guarantees.
And there are no guarantees in things the legislature does either.
No, that's sort of true, too.
Last year, I know the supplemental budget that we talked about, you wanted some extra money for firefighting, wildland firefighting.
Yeah.
Nothing goes quite the way you intended. There was a fire season last year. Based on the weather that we're having in Wyoming this winter, which in my lifetime is unprecedented, it's been warm and windy and dry when it should be cold and snowy. First, is there an executive order that you can sign that blanket Wyoming with about 8 inches of snow between now and...
I've tried to do that. I've been praying hard, too.
Okay. Short of that, where do you see Wyoming's firefighting budget, financial availability heading into this year, which has all the makings of a doozy of a fire season?
During my time as governor, I'm not going to advertise this, but during my time as governor, we've had the Mullen Fire, which at that time was the largest fire. That was overshadowed by the house draw, the elk, Flat Rock, all the fires, the Haystack, all these fires that happened 2024, our worst fire season. Last year, we had the Red Canyon fire. And I think the lessons that came out of that were that our volunteer firefighters are being stretched to the max in a lot of ways. And one of the biggest lessons that came out of that was that we need to be able to communicate what's going on the fire in a way that's trustworthy, that's transparent, and that people understand and have confidence in. And we've really talked about 2 modules. And the modules have all the capacities of being able to manage a fire. They'll still use volunteers, they'll still use local fire departments, but they can bring a level of coordination that's key. We wanted to see one on the west and one on the east. I think the Joint Appropriations Committee is saying only on the east. I think that will be problematic.
Property tax continues to be an enormous issue. Big property tax measures, reductions were passed a couple of years ago. There have been consequences and results can be seen, starting to be seen now. How do you think that's gone so far?
We've passed a whole bunch of reforms over the last couple of years. Yeah, and there was a need. I mean, when you saw the appreciation, Wyoming was open. When the rest of the country was closed, people moved to Wyoming because they really appreciated what Wyoming had. That raised property values, that raised assessments, and for people on fixed incomes, it really made life difficult. So I think Wyoming was correct in trying to respond to that. But with all of the layers of these reforms, everybody had their own property tax issue and so on. Last year, we actually had to pass a statute just to say, first you do this, then you do that, then you do this other thing, and here you're eligible for the other thing. I recommended this year that the legislature step back and look at a comprehensive way to sort of address this issue. We managed to pass a 4th tier of property for private property, and that went unaddressed last year. And I think that is the right tool to be able to say, here's how we do the best job of being able to make sure Wyoming citizens don't have to pay excessive property tax and aren't exposed to, real appreciation. I think there's value in sitting down and really looking at where we can go with that particular tool.
I was speaking off camera with your strong right arm, Amy Edmonds, and she said in preparing the budget this year, a quote from Abraham Lincoln came up. Lincoln pointed out, government is to do the things that we can't do as individuals for ourselves.
Yeah.
And that in putting your budget together, you're trying to keep that in mind. So I'm just thinking in terms of the property tax. We've got libraries closing now and streets and alleys and infrastructure being impacted, schools being impacted. This whole concept of the voters, whether they think about it consciously or not, sort of like the things that responsible government can provide, but it does have to be paid for.
I'm glad you reminded me of that quote because it is absolutely true. And if you look around Wyoming, we have a very low population state. But it's always interesting to me to talk about what the cost of road construction is. And as you know, the Joint Appropriations Committee is looking seriously at WYDOT's, the Wyoming Department of Transportation's budget. And Darren Westby, the director, has talked about it's just a little bit of peanut butter all around the state. And eventually peanut butter kind of breaks down. We've seen that in Platte County. We've seen that in a whole bunch of places. When you think about, this is a few years ago, it's about $2 million a mile if everything is sort of easy to do. In towns, it's $4 million a mile. And if you start seeing the infrastructure break down, Thermopolis, for example, not long ago, it all clay pipe for the sewer system, and it failed. So what Wyoming has been able to do with our mineral revenue and with our investment in revenue is to be able to help those communities with those extraordinary projects. But they all have to have a bit of skin in the game. to make that happen. And that's where property tax becomes so valuable. And what's particularly important to me about that, Steve, is that people vote on their property taxes. If it's a mill for this or a mill for that, they control whether they want to pay for it or whether they don't. It's not the legislature saying, we think you can have a cemetery now. It is the people themselves being able to make their own decisions. And that's one of the things that I think is missed in this conversation of let's just reduce everything. Is you wake up one day and you won't have those rights, you won't have those opportunities, and you won't have the infrastructure.
Yeah, and the opportunity to at least make some of these decisions locally.
Absolutely.
So that the people can, it's not a big tax coming down from above. We've decided we'll show how to spend property tax ourselves responsibly. The Wyoming way is often said.
Exactly, and if it's not well-crafted, I can think of an example in Johnson County where they tried to put everything in it, and the voters said, no, we're not doing that. But when they came back and said our senior citizens need a little bit more, everybody said that's what we're going to do.
Governor Mark Gordon, that's a great pleasure as always, and I'm happy to say a privilege to speak with you and sit with you for a longer period of time. Good luck with your decision-making ahead and the wrestling match that is inevitable, no matter who's in charge and with the legislature and beyond. And thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Steve.